Hey class, we're going to talk today about sex, gender, and sexuality. So let's start with the basics, the foundations of who we are, our genes. As you might know, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. That last pair are our sex chromosomes. Most of us have either an XX or an XY combination. Now, I say most of us because there are exceptions to the rule. When we're talking about sex, we're talking about the biological aspect of our nature. What's in our genes, what we can see in our bodies. Now, sex is inconsistent among species. Sex doesn't act the same way in all species, so our understandings of sex from a human perspective are different from the understandings of sex from a bird or seahorse or even like looking at fungi, right? There are some species of fungi that can have over 20,000 or over 32,000 different sexes. When we're looking at other species, insects, birds, they might not have an X and an X or an X and a Y. They could have Z's, they could have Y's. So when we're looking at these chromosomes, we have to understand that they can be different based off of what we're looking at. So it's not just XX and XY. So as you know, the typical combinations are XX and XY. XX typically leads to a female. XY typically leads to a male. But there can be other combinations. You could have three X chromosomes. You could have only an X chromosome. You can have two X chromosomes and one Y chromosome. Uh, you might also notice that there's the Y chromosome with no X chromosome, which can happen, but unfortunately, somebody who has these genes will never be born. This type of child will end in a miscarriage. You are probably familiar with some of the differences between male and female bodies, but we're going to talk real quick about the XO and the XXY. So people who are born XO are referred to as having Turner syndrome. People who are born XXY can be referred to as having Klinefelter syndrome. And you'll see that there are some slight differences in their bodies as a result of the lack of or the presence of an extra chromosome. So with Turner syndrome, you might see things such as short stature, a low hairline, uh, differences in the thorax and the placement of nipples, right? Elbow deformity, folds of skin around the neck, specific facial features, and even though they have female genitalia, they won't experience menstruation. In Klinefelter syndrome, you'll have testicular atrophy, so very small. The pubic hair will look like the pattern of a female, not the traditional male pattern. They might lose chest hairs. They might have impairments in IQ, trouble growing a beard, and they might also develop breasts, and they might have bone issues, so osteoporosis. Now, it's not just our chromosomes that determine how we develop, it's also our hormones, the chemicals in our body that tell cells to behave in a certain way. So, the presence or absence of these hormones, which is partially determined by our genes, is going to help us develop in certain ways. The issue is that sometimes the sensitivity of our cells to specific hormones is going to affect our development. So you might be born male with an X and a Y, but your body might be resistant to testosterone. So even though testosterone is telling your body do male things, develop in male ways, your body might not develop in a traditionally male manner. So, when we're talking about sexual development, there are two main periods where we have prenatal development before you're born, and then puberty. So, you'll see upon birth that there are some key sexual differences, the presence or absence of a penis or vagina, right? But as time goes on, more differences will become apparent. So, for example, differences in the shape of the hips and waist, height differences, broader shoulders. These types of things tend to develop later in life and become more pronounced later in life. And they are what we call secondary sex characteristics. They clue you into somebody's sex, but they're not the things that are directly related to reproduction. So, if sex is biological, then what is gender? Is gender different than sex? Kind of yes, kind of no. Gender is a social construct. It's basically what society says you should do based off of your sex. So, men wear blue and drive trucks. Women wear pink and drive different cars. I don't know, convertibles. What's the sexist? What the? I'm trying to think of like a womanly car. According to society, Ford Focus. I have a friend who had a Ford Focus, so I'm just gonna say that's what women drive, not trucks like men. Nope, Ford Focuses. They're smart. They're very smart vehicles. They're good value, I've heard. So I'm not sponsored by Ford, but if you click the link below, you can get some savings on a Ford Focus. So the gender is this idea of, well, based off of what is between your legs, this is how we expect you to act. But society says that there are two genders, but gender is based off of sex, and sex isn't a clear cut thing, right? It's not just XX and XY, and it's also based off of your hormones and your development. So, how do we say that there are only two genders? In addition, people can be born intersex, where they have the primary sex characteristics of both sexes. So, how many genders are there really in society? So, because gender in our society is very binary, either or, you're either this or that, we have a few terms that can help us understand somebody's potential gender identity. So, a lot of you are cisgender. Your sex is one way, and your gender identity matches that. So, if I'm born biologically male, and by biologically male, I mean I usually we're talking about external characteristics. So if I have male parts and I feel like I am male, then I am cisgender because my understanding of myself, based off of social factors, matches what society says I should do based off of the parts that I have. That's cisgender. Now, sometimes what happens, and we mentioned some of the biological complications that are related to this, you can be born with male parts, but you could feel female on the inside. And uh, we're really, as scientists, like, it's a very complicated process. And the reason why it's so complicated is because nature doesn't think in categories. Nature is just nature. So when you try to ascribe social rules to nature, you start to get complicated, right? We want to categorize things. That's why we're like, well, if you're a bird, you can fly, right? That's just a rule that all birds fly. If we categorize you as a bird, you can fly, unless you're like a penguin or an ostrich. But we're not going to change our understanding of birds. We're just going to say that there are certain birds that can't fly. So when it comes to our gender constructs, we're like, well, we know that like all men don't act in one way and all women don't act in one way. But if you don't act in that way, we're going to say that you're not doing it right, right? So the issue with this isn't people's gender identity. It's just we have very restrictive views on gender. We're uh, we think that everybody thinks about gender the same way, but if you look at other cultures, uh, what it means to be masculine is going to vary, right? In other cultures, some men hold hands and kiss each other, and that is a normal sign of male affection, and there's nothing strange about it. In other countries, there are third genders, and it is acceptable to label yourself as such without anybody thinking that it's weird because it's a normal, accepted part of society. So when you're looking at gender, you have to realize that you might be looking at it from the lens of your culture and just how you were raised, right? In growing up, a super masculine car might be a hot rod, convertible. In another part of the country, that's an impractical car. So the most masculine car might be a truck, right? So even little things like that in our country we can't agree on. Uh, so the gender identity is also based off of the rules of gender in your society. So this is a very Western view of gender, just to give you the disclaimer. So identifying as transgender is saying, well, my biology is this way, but as far as like what is externally viewable, uh, society says that I should be acting in this way, but I feel like I should be acting in a different way than how society says I should be acting based on my biology. So I'm going to identify as the gender that matches how I feel I should be behaving, what I feel like I am on the inside, right? So being cisgender is when your gender identity matches your sex. Being transgender is when your gender identity is opposite of what your sex is. Then we also have the identities of being genderqueer or non-binary, which is more so a statement of, well, I don't want to subscribe to either extreme because I feel qualities of both, and it can, like it's hard for me to just say I'm definitively this, right? In America, there are people who are not Democrats and not Republicans. There's a variety of people in between. There are people who say that they're Democrats and but might be more conservative than other Democrats. They might consider themselves moderates, right? There. So when we're looking at anything that has an extreme, we have to understand that like it's not either or. So depending on one person's understanding of themselves, they might identify as genderqueer or non-binary because they don't want to say that because they don't feel like they fit neatly into one category. So if this is new to you, be aware that you don't know what is going on with somebody biologically, right? Uh, I am a cisgender male. I've been mistaken for a woman because my hair is long, and that is a thing that I'm not. It doesn't upset me. I've just accepted that it's like a thing that happens when you have long hair, and I guess my shoulders might not be broad enough, right? So now, if somebody came up to me and was like, "Well, you have long hair, you need to identify as a woman," I'd go, "Well, I see myself as a man who just happens to have long hair," right? So that person doesn't know me, but if they say that I have to ascribe to their view of who I am, I would take issue with that, right? So if you meet somebody and they explain to you how they prefer to be referred, you don't know what's going on with them biologically. And you also don't need to know, right? That's a very personal thing. In general, in American culture, we don't ask people to prove their gender by like describing what is in between their legs. But for some reason, people sometimes feel entitled to do that with transgender people or genderqueer people or non binary people. And that's not okay. So when you start understanding how complicated sex is at a biological level, and the fact that even though you might have very masculine or very feminine parts, your brain development and other aspects of your development might be completely opposite to that, you realize that, well, we can't just assume that because somebody looks one way that they are that way. So really having respect for people's identity is the simplest thing that you can do. And as long as you, in most cases, like as long as you make an effort to be respectful, you'll be okay. So if this isn't common sense to you, be respectful to people. That's all I'm saying. Great. Let's move on. Then we get into sexual orientation, which is even more complicated. Now, the terms that we use for sexual orientation are not super complicated, but really breaking down what that is kind of the issue. So, first of all, let's just talk about the general terms. We have straight or heterosexual people. Those are people who are attracted to the opposite sex, right? If you're gay, you're male and attracted to other men. Lesbian, you're female, you're attracted to other women. If you're bisexual or pansexual, you're attracted to both genders or all genders. A person's decision to identify as one or the other is going to be based off of their own feelings and expressions of gender. So pansexuality is just more trans inclusive and inclusive of all people who might be non-binary, right? Bisexuality, uh, just by the semantics of it, implies only being attracted to men and women. But if they're, but it seems like it excludes people who are in between that. So some people prefer the term pansexuality to seem more inclusive. Other people will use the term bisexuality, but the term that people use is going to depend on what they want to use to describe themselves. And then we have asexuality, which is no sexual attraction or limited sexual attraction towards other people. So when we're talking about attraction, there's a difference between who you find attractive, who you want to date or marry, and who you want to have sex with. Attraction isn't standard across all aspects of sexual orientation. Like some people might be interested in casual sex with some people, might be interested in long-term relationships with other people, may find people attractive, but might not be interested in sex with them, might be interested in sex with them, but might not be interested in dating them. There might be fantasies involved, but no actual desire to implement things. So when we're looking at sexual orientation, we realize that it's not just a category, because you could consider yourself straight, but occasionally have a sexual fantasy. It's a normal thing. Some people experiment at some point in their lives and they become more cemented in their sexual orientation or become more fluid. These things happen, but it's not necessarily set in stone. Some people's sexual orientation can shift over time. It can broaden, it can narrow. Some people will change their fetishes, things that they enjoy and appreciate or look for in a partner. So even with something like asexuality, it's not black or white. People who are asexual can have different levels of enjoyment of sex, might have crushes on people, but no sexual desire. It can really vary. So when we're looking at sexual orientation, we have to understand it's not, no, you might have an idea of what it should look like, but a lot of times it won't look exactly like that. So categories are tough because they help us categorize people. That's why it's a category. That wow, the real surprising new fact. Categories help you categorize things, but they're helpful to give us a beginning understanding of these things. They allow us to understand how things typically look like. But we have to be careful about being prescriptive with categories. So you are this, so you have to do this, right? You are this way, so why are you doing this? When we start doing that, then we run into the issue of more binaries. You have to be either this or this. And that's not how sex works. That's not how gender works. That's not how sexual orientation works. So, one criticism of breaking the gender binary is, well, there are just too many things. Everybody just wants to create a name. But if our categories are super rigid and people don't feel like they fit neatly into a specific category, you have to create a new category in order to feel like you fit into that category, right? Same thing with politics. If I think that I'm a Democrat and then somebody's like, well, no, Democrats are supposed to do this, this, and this. And I might say, well, guess I'm a democratic socialist, right? I say I'm a Republican, and people are like, you're too extreme to be a Republican. And I'm like, okay, well, Tea Party then, right? The more we say that people don't fit into a category that they identify as, the more need there is to create new categories. But if we understand that there's a wide range of variability within a category, then that makes life a little bit easier. That's my opinion, right? We shouldn't be so rigid in our understanding of these things because these things just aren't rigid in nature. So, if I have not said continuum before, I'm going to say it now. A continuum is a spectrum It's just a range of infinite possibility between two extreme points. So with biological sex, you have your typical male, your typical female, but you can be anywhere in between. You could be biologically male, have lots of testosterone, but still, based on your biology, develop some typical female brain characteristics. So maybe you're more responsive to social emotional cues, right? That's a typically female trait present in a male, right? So your biology is slightly different, but you could still identify as male. You can still choose to express yourself as male. Or you could be male, identify as male, and then express yourself differently, right? There's no rule in the rule book of nature that says that a man can't wear a skirt if he wants to. In some cultures, that's considered normal, right? We have kilts in Scotland. In some martial arts, there are skirts or like long pant-like skirt things. I cannot remember what they're called, but they're used in practicing sword play. So if you think that like, oh, well, men don't do this, there are some parts of America where women don't wear pants because only men wear pants, right? So wearing pants is a very masculine form of gender expression. So you have to realize that these things aren't set in stone, right? So everything exists on a continuum. Where you end up on this continuum is where you end up. And it's not anyone else's job to tell you where you should be. It's up to you to determine where you are and then be okay with being there. So even though sex, gender, sexual orientation are not disorders, there can be disorders associated with them. For example, we have gender dysmorphic disorder, which a few people misunderstand. Not you, because you're super smart and amazing, but it used to be called gender identity disorder, recently changed to gender dysmorphic disorder. But essentially, it's when somebody's issues with gender identity are causing distress or impairment. So if I'm born biologically male, I identify as female because that is who I know myself to be. I don't have gender dysmorphic disorder. But if I am born biologically male and I feel like I might be female on the inside, and this is causing me stress, this is making me feel worried and giving me anxiety, that would be gender dysmorphic disorder because the struggle that I'm having with myself is causing me psychological distress. So that's what it's saying. It's not saying that the gender identity is the issue, it's the anxiety and the depression and the stress caused by the struggle with gender identity that we're diagnosing. There can also be issues with the act of sex itself. Some people have low sex drive, which would be hypoactivity. This is only diagnosable if, again, there's distress or impairment. So if the person is fine with the fact that they don't have the sex drive, it's not an issue, right? But if this person is very stressed about it, then we talk about it. Erectile dysfunction, delayed or premature ejaculation, or female orgasmic disorder, so issues with the actual act of sex itself. There are also pain disorders, like vaginismus, which is a very like painful spasming of the muscles that makes sex very difficult to have. Then we also have the paraphilias. So these are behaviors, like specific sexual behaviors that can be problematic. Some definitely always are problematic. Others are only problematic when they cause harm to other people or stress to the person who's doing them. So, for example, we have fetishistic disorder. It's okay to have a fetish. Maybe you really enjoy feet, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Aside, you tell that to your psychologist, and they'll be like, "Great, cool. You know what you like, right?" Some people with a specific fetish can only experience sexual gratification if that fetish is present. So maybe your partner is wearing socks and you cannot see their feet, and they want to keep their socks on, but you cannot orgasm unless you see their bare feet, and this is causing you issues. That's a very silly, made up example of a fetishistic disorder. But if the impairment is so severe that it's causing you to not be able to engage in sex the way that you would like to, or it's affecting your relationship with your partner or partners, then you would be diagnosed with the disorder. Same thing with sexual masochism or sexual sadism, which is enjoying pain or enjoying giving pain to others and getting sexual gratification from that. If that is done in a safe environment, there's no issue. If you're doing it and it's causing harm to you beyond what is safe, or you're causing harm to others beyond what is safe, that would be diagnosable. Frauderism and voyeurism are getting pleasure from rubbing against other people, for example, on a subway, or watching other people engage in sexual behaviors, but non consensually. And then pedophilia is specifically sexual attraction to prepubescent individuals. So it is a little bit of a misnomer sometimes. If you have a 40-year-old person and they see a 17-year-old and they're like, I'm going to slide into their DMs. Yeah. Right. Their behavior is creepy, but they aren't a diagnosable pedophile. Strictly from a clinical sense, pedophilia is attraction to prepubescent individuals. Now, behavior is still illegal, but it's not considered pedophilia. There is in case you were curious, a specific term for attraction to people who are not of the age of consent, but are have already had puberty. That is a phebophilia. So you wouldn't be able to diagnose this person with a specific disorder, but you could say that guy isn't a phebophiliac, and he's a little creepy. Don't flirt with high school girls, 40-year-old man. And then we all laugh because that's really gross. And I think that's going to end. I like how this entire time I've just been like, hey guys, whatever your experiences, however you want to identify, that's okay. We need to be respectful. And I just end on like, but if you're a pedophile or just like a creepy dude who's like preying on people like half your age, like, you know, let's not do that, okay? So I think that's a good note to end on. Love yourself. Love yourself. Know that whatever you feel, however you identify, it is okay if you don't fit into that mold, but also please respect other people. And if somebody cannot give consent, then leave them alone. All right, this has been fun. Take care. Have a wonderful day. You're doing great. You're doing great. We're all doing great right now. Everybody's doing great. That's not a lie. I'm doing great. That's why I'm saying I'm doing great so much. Stop asking questions. I'm fine. I'm fine.